think about fall when it is so hot outside, but it is definitely the time to be thinking about fall. So I also have Patricia O'Brien on the line helping me out today as our Master Gardener volunteer. So she'll be letting people in from the waiting room. In case you accidentally get kicked out, Patricia will be around to help you out. And thank you to those of you who chimed in the chat where you're coming to us from. I, of course, will be talking about frost dates today. And I just kind of want to see where we're coming from so I can kind of tell you, you know, think earlier, think later, stuff like that. So thank you for that. And we will go ahead and dive right into the presentation. At the end, I do have a really quick 2-question poll. If you're around and answering 2 really easy questions that would help me for my reporting and feedback purposes. I also just want to let you know that you will be getting the slides sent to you as well as a recording of the class and some further resources that might be helpful for you to look at when you are planning your fall garden. So here are the topics of what we're going to be talking about today. First, we're going to talk about why would you even want to plant a fall garden, and there are some major benefits to it. So we'll go over that. And then I think the real meat of this program today is what can you plant and when can you plant it? So we're going to spend most of our time talking about that. Different things that you would plant at different times, and we're going to talk frost dates because that's really what it all hinges on. We're going to talk a little bit about some things to do before you get your fall garden in the ground, although it's very likely that some of you already have. There's lots of stuff that probably needed to go in like a week or 2 ago, but still plenty of options that you can plant still. And then we'll go over care of the fall garden, which honestly isn't that much different than care of like a spring or summer garden. But we'll hit all the bases: mulch, watering, harvesting, just kind of really brief, high level. And of course, if there's any further questions on any of those, we'll get to them. And then I wanted to talk season extension. So this is something to keep in mind this fall when it's starting to get cold, but you still have plants in the ground. And then also keep in mind next spring, if you want to get a little bit of a head start, some of these same techniques work. So we'll talk about how to combat some of that light frost and cold weather with some pretty easy and cheap techniques. So why plant a fall garden? What are the benefits? Well, for one, it makes good use of your garden space. By now, if you planted crops in the spring, some of those things like your lettuces and some of those more cool weather crops are probably starting to bolt or just not doing too good in this really hot weather we've been having, especially down here in Pueblo. It's been real hot. So those things probably are starting to come out of your garden and you're going to have some space opening up. So you may as well use that space and go ahead and plant some second crops for fall. Once the spring crops are done, you will want to prep the soil before you do more planting. So we will talk about that a little bit further, but do keep that in mind that it shouldn't just be pull the spring crops out and pop the fall plants right in. You should do a little bit of prep just to make sure they have a good media to grow. Another really good benefit of planting a fall garden is that the temperatures work out really nicely. And for a lot of this, we're assuming that we're talking about planting seeds. And transplants are a little bit differently, you know, you can adjust a little bit, but when we're talking about seeds, oftentimes if you maybe start them inside or something in the spring, you might use a warming mat underneath your tray, right? So usually seeds germinate a little bit better with a little bit warmer temperatures. So right now, the soil is pretty much as warm as it's going to get. We're in the middle of the hot season. The soil is very warm. So planting seeds right now, it gives them that warm, moist environment so that they'll germinate really well for you. And then once they start to develop and we start to get, fruits and greens starting to actually be ready to harvest, that's when the temperatures are starting to cool down. So it tends to lead to better fruits, sweeter things. Their sugars are able to build up more temperatures. And, it's also just better to harvest in those cooler temperatures. Things don't wilt as much and things of that nature. So the temperature wise, it works out almost better to do a fall garden than to do a spring or a summer garden from seed anyway. It's a little easier. You're going to run into less insect and disease issues. Just the natural life cycle of most of the insects that we have in our vegetable gardens in this part of the world here, they're not going to sync up as much with the fall garden. So you're not going to have as much of that to deal with. Of course, less watering is going to be required. You're going to have to still put some on now during germination time. Obviously, it's still pretty hot, but as time goes on and it starts to cool down, you're going to have to water less and less because there won't be as much evaporation. So that is definitely a good thing. And then, of course, you can grow things that can't handle the heat. Peppers, things like that. They're out there now, probably handling the heat just fine. But cool season crops, lettuces, broccoli, some of our root crops, they're not going to really love that midsummer heat. Definitely, you probably are out there shading them and stuff if you are growing them. So it's easier to grow things of a cooler season nature in a fall garden. All right, so let's talk about things you can plant. That's what we're all here for, right? We want to know what we can put in our fall garden. So like I said in the beginning, it's all about the first frost date and the days to maturity of whatever you're going to plant. Those are really the two pieces of information that you need to know before you plant your fall garden. So on average, and we'll do a little disclaimer here, but on average, Pueblo can expect to have our first hard frost around October 8th. Now, last year it froze like end of September, and then that was an early frost for us. Sometimes it might not freeze till maybe like mid-October. It's a guess. That's an average from the past maybe like 10 to 20 years of when we can expect to get that first hard frost in this area. If you live in another area, I know I saw Westcliff and Colorado Springs come up in the chat. You can look up the average first frost according to CSU for your area. And I think the easiest way to get there, honestly, is just to Google extension, climate summary, Colorado Springs or Westcliff or wherever you are. And they have a whole bunch of different publications. You can pull that up and see the charts with all the different probabilities of when it's going to freeze, and it should give you a pretty good idea. Just for the purposes of examples, I'm going to stick with talking about Pueblo and our October 8th frost. For the participant who was near Colorado City, you might not have your own climate summary for Colorado City out near Hatchet Ranch, but you can probably expect maybe like a week or two sooner than Pueblo. So you kind of just adjust a little bit based on your exact area. But we'll go with October 8th for a lot of our examples here. So that's the first frost date. Obviously, a lot of the stuff isn't going to do great after the first frost. Some will. We'll talk about that. But that's kind of when we want to be aiming to be done with a lot of our crops is around that first frost date. So that's why we need to know the days to maturity of the plants that we're talking about. We need to know how long this plant takes from sprouting. Now the days to maturity is after it sprouts. So from sprouting till the fruits or whatever it is that we're harvesting from the plant is going to be done and ready to harvest. Sprout to harvest is what the days to maturity is. So you will need to tack on an extra 7 to 14 days roughly for germination. Since those days to maturity are from when it sprouts, we do need to take that into account that it's going to take a little bit of time for these plants to actually come up. So when you're doing your calculations, just be sure to add that in. Some things sprout faster than others, but maybe just to be safe, give it like an extra 10 days. So to figure out the days to maturity, and it depends on the variety too. So whatever specific variety of lettuce or peas or whatever it is that you want to grow, you want to make sure you're looking up the days to maturity for that variety. So if you have a seed packet that you're using seeds from, that's easy. It's going to be on the back of the packet. Just look at the back and see the days to maturity. If not, then you might, giving it a Google is easy enough. If you need some help with that, I can for sure help with some research at the extension office or our master gardeners can. So that is something you definitely want to know. And the specific for your variety is how many days is it going to take from sprout to harvest. So here's some reference dates. Again, these are for the frost date in Pueblo, but today, July 20th, we got about 80 days left until our first frost. So still lots and lots of time to plant stuff. So, we're looking at maybe stuff with like a 65 days to maturity, roughly 65 to 70, once we account for germination. That's stuff that would need to go into the ground today, this weekend. Once we get to August 9th, we're looking, that's our 60-day mark. And September 8th is going to be our 30-day mark. And there's stuff that can go in on all of those different marks, and we'll talk about all of those. Also, keep in mind, some plants can handle a little frost. One frost isn't going to kill them. And we'll talk a little bit more about those. But if you're curious, maybe just do a little research on some of the plants and see, can they tolerate any frost, or what can I do to make them tolerate frost? And that's when we start talking about season extension. So mid-July, these are things that you need to get in the ground very soon if you'd like to plant. This is all stuff that's not going to handle a frost very well. So stuff you need to get in and get it going, and it's going to be done by that first frost date. So you can read the list here, but cabbage, green onion, spinach. You want to do a second round of summer squash, peas, cauliflower, things like that. These are kind of our longer days to maturity fall garden plants. And like I said, you'll get these slides, so don't worry. You don't have to worry about writing these all down or anything. But this is all stuff that ideally by mid-July you get into the grounds, maybe next year or even early July, so that you have plenty of time for germination. But these are some of our longer taking plants for fall. Late July, so you got a little bit of time still to get these in the ground, but you definitely want to start thinking about doing it soon. Broccoli, a lot of varieties of carrots will take about this long. Turnips, Chinese cabbage, and that'll give you about 70 days until frost. So you're looking at maybe 55, 60 days to maturity on these crops that you'd be planting in late July. Broccoli can take a little nip for sure, probably not like a super hard frost for multiple days. Now, things like the root crops, turnips, they can definitely stay in the ground all winter long. So that's another thing to consider. Early August, we've got about 60 days until frost, and you can definitely still plant lots of things around here anyway. Kale, turnip greens, beets, a lot of the different leaf lettuces can wait to go in until early August. And then that way when they sprout, it'll start to maybe be a little cooler. Swiss chard, again, these are all things that can take a little nip of frost. So the later we get into planting, the more frost tolerant things kind of begin to be. Transplants of any greens can go in. If you're doing a transplant of like a leaf lettuce, you can put that in mid-August, late August, because you harvest them anytime. So those can wait quite a bit of more time than if you're going from seed. So keep that in mind. Radishes, if you get just a real late start, but you really want to plant something for fall, radishes are your friend because they only need about 30 days. So you can plant them around Pueblo as late as the first week of September. That still gives us about 30 days until we're going to get a frost. and you can grow your radishes from seed in about 30 days. So late August, early September, you can definitely still be putting radishes in the ground. And like I said, these root crops, you know, the turnips, the beets, the carrots, these things can stay in the ground during the cold weather. Uh, Radishes, though, don't do great left in the ground. They're one of the root crops that are kind of, they'll maybe like rot. They're just not quite as hardy as some of these other root crops. But take that into consideration that, you know, even if they're ready, but you don't maybe go get them in time, that's okay. They'll do just fine. In fact, the cold weather kind of sweetens them up and improves the flavor. So it's totally fine to leave some of your root crops in the ground over the cold weather times. Let's talk garlic. This is a little bit different because you do want to plant the garlic in a fall garden, but you're not going to be harvesting it in the fall. You're just thinking ahead for next summer. So generally in Pueblo, we're planting our garlic in early October. We're planting pretty much like right when that frost is going to be expected, late September, early October. Maybe move that up a week or two for you folks in Colorado Springs, West Cliff, places like that. So it's planted for the summer harvest. You're going to plant your cloves in your fall garden after you've done your soil amending, things of that nature. Mulch it. We'll talk about mulching. It's really important for things like this, especially. And you're going to want to keep it watered all winter long. You don't have to go out every single day and water like you water your tomatoes and stuff probably around here. But you want to go out and put some water on it like every couple weeks. Just don't let it completely dry out, especially if we don't get a lot of precipitation during the winter time. And then, you know, you'll start bumping that water up as the growing season next year in 2022 begins. Keep it well watered through the spring and early summer. And then about mid-June, you're going to cut the water off. Let those bulbs kind of finish forming and drying out in the soil. You'll cut off water for about a couple weeks. And then usually around early July, the leaves will start to die. And that's when you know it's time to harvest the garlic that you planted last fall. So it's a bit of a process, but fall planted garlic does much better than if you try to do it in the spring and rush it along. You'll get nice, much bigger heads and things of that nature. So definitely think about that. Plant your garlic when you're out there planting your tulips and your daffodils, your spring bulbs this fall as well. And you'll be thanking yourself next summer when you have nice fresh garlic. So like I said, there are some things you want to consider before planting, and really that's soil. I mean, you definitely want to think about your plan, you know, how are you going to water? What if a frost does come early? What am I going to do to protect my plants? Planning out the space and things of that nature are all things that you want to consider. But soil is kind of the big thing that you want to make sure that your soil is ready for a second crop, especially if you already grew some spring, summer crops in that same area. Then, you know, I'm sure they kind of depleted some of the nutrients and things of that nature. Maybe the texture is not ideal. So you definitely want to check into that a little bit. And probably one of the best, most general recommendations that we can make here is to mix in some plant-based compost to improve the texture, the tilth. Compost releases a very small amount of nutrients at a very slow rate, so that's helpful as well. It's not going to be adequate as your only fertilizer, but it is helpful and it'll make your soil ready to support another round of plants. You can also mix in some fertilizers, you know, some nitrogen kind of based stuff, blood meal, fish emulsion, alfalfa pellets would be some good options of things to mix in the soil before you plant. And, you know, consider mixing in some cover crops as well. So a cover crop is something that you would plant, you know, around the fall time, and it would actually grow all winter long. These are pretty hardy plants. And then in the spring, you would till those in to the soil. and they act as a kind of what we call green manure. It's not manure, but it does the same kind of thing with adding the nitrogen back into the soil. So if you're planting already some fall crops in your fall garden, you can mix in some things maybe like winter rye, or there's a lot of different legume things in the legume family, because legumes are nitrogen fixers. So those are things you might want to grow and just plan to leave them and till them in the spring. And that's a really good way to work on improving your soil for the spring. But then it also kind of, having those crops growing all through the off season is going to promote, your soil to be kind of stable. Having the plants there is going to act as a mulch in a way. So mixing in some cover crops is a really, really great idea of something to do in your fall garden as well. Let's talk care a little bit. Like I said, it's not drastically different than how you're going to care for your normal vegetable garden in the spring and the summer. But the main thing I would say is make sure that you mulch. Mulch is very important, especially in the fall garden. If you want to leave any root crops in the soil for the winter, they definitely are going to need to have some mulch over them. If you plant garlic in the fall, you got to do mulch. And then, it's just generally a great idea to mulch plants anyway, no matter if you're keeping overwintering them or not. So why? What good is mulch? Well, generally it stabilizes the soil moisture, so it keeps things kind of moist. You have to water less, and keeping things consistently moist is good for plant health, rather than letting it dry out and get wet in a cycle like that. It also stabilizes soil temperature. So, right now, like I said, it's pretty hot, but it's going to start to cool down. But if you have a mulch, it'll kind of keep things a little more level and not such dramatic changes in soil temperature. Also, when it starts to get real cold, having that mulch over those root crops or those garlic cloves is going to keep that temperature for them pretty stable, keep the moisture in for them. So that's good. Also, having mulch prevents frost heaving. So sometimes if you do leave root crops in the ground and we start to get like freeze and thaw cycles going on, I mean, we see what that does to the roads, right? It cracks the roads, and that can wreak some havoc on the root crops that you have left in your garden as well. So mulching them keeps things just a little more stable and prevents them from heaving up out of the soil because they're freezing and thawing and expanding and things of that nature. So for a vegetable garden, straw lawn clippings are both great options. Of course, with lawn clippings, you want to make sure that they don't have, herbicides or anything that could be dangerous to potentially put on an edible plant that had been used on them. So you want to know the source of your lawn clippings for sure. But straw and lawn clippings are both really good mulches for a vegetable garden. Compost is a really good mulch. It doesn't necessarily have to be mixed in to your garden. You can just lay it on top and it acts as a mulch, and then you can till it in next spring, and it kind of does a 2-for-1 for you. And then of course cover crops, which we already talked about. Those are all great options for mulching your fall garden, which I would definitely suggest you do. And these are all organic mulches. Okay, so they're not versus like an inorganic mulch that would be something like rocks or pea gravel or something like that. So organic mulches are great because they're going to improve the soil for next spring. You can end up tilling this stuff in. It's just going to add organic matter. It'll break down over the winter. And that's always a good thing to do for your soil, adding more organic matter, especially in the vegetable garden. Wood chips are an organic mulch, but I would not use them in a vegetable garden. And the reason being is, those big chunks of wood, it takes a lot to break them down. And as soil microbes attempt to break things down, they use up nitrogen in the soil. So because it takes so much to break down a wood chip, it ends up pulling more nitrogen out of the soil than it's really worth, and mixing them in, they're going to take forever to break down. They're going to remove nitrogen. So wood chips aren't a good option for inside of the vegetable garden. They're a fantastic option for like walkways on the side and areas like that, flower gardens, in areas where it's not too windy to use them. They're great. They're a great option. But for inside of the vegetable garden, I would not use wood chips. Watering, of course, in the beginning, during the kind of growing season, if you will, the hot summer times, water just as you did in the spring and summer. Of course, once you plant seeds, that soil is going to need to stay pretty moist until they germinate. They're not going to germinate if it dries out. So you could just set yourself behind if you let it dry out. And then as the temperatures start to cool, you can start to taper off that watering. And there's no really secret magic schedule of how that goes. You just kind of have to get out there and feel like, okay, well, it's starting to cool down. The garden's not drying out quite as fast. I could probably, cut down to once a day, or maybe now I'm at every 2 days. So just kind of get out there and see when your garden needs it. And that's the best advice for how often you should be watering. But it naturally is going to taper down as the season goes on. Any time of the year, it's best to avoid overhead watering. That can cause some disease issues and it's inefficient. Watering at the base of the plant is best, whether you're watering with a watering can. If you have a drip system, that's of course ideal because you're delivering water right to the roots and there's not a lot of waste at all. Soaker hoses are awesome for a vegetable garden. But even if you're using your hose or your watering can, just make sure you get in there and get at the base of the plants and try not to wet the leaves and too much. And then of course, like I already mentioned, don't forget to winter water your garlic. And hey, while we're on the topic, winter water all of your trees, lawns, perennials. They will all thank you for it come next spring if we keep those things watered during the fall and winter. Fertilizing. You'll be just like with any vegetable garden, you're gonna need to do a little fertilizing probably. The best way to tell exactly what you need in your soil and exactly what you should use is to get a soil test. But I know that at this point, to get a soil test from an analytical laboratory, you're probably looking a couple weeks to get the results back, 2 or 3 weeks. And maybe at this point, you don't really have that kind of time to submit a soil test, but definitely consider doing that for the spring. So general suggestions on fertilizing. You want to focus on the NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. That's what this stands for. So when you see the numbers on the bag, that's the weight of those 3 different nutrients in that order by volume of that bag of fertilizer. So generally, I think a 10-10-10 is what I would suggest if you just don't really know exactly what's going on with your soil. A 10-10-10 is fine. You can get a 5-10-10 or a 5-10-5 and probably just do it twice as often, just because the nitrogen amount is a little bit lower and that first number, the 5 is the nitrogen. You can also mix something in at planting. Like I mentioned, the blood meal, the fish emulsion, these are all organic fertilizers. And organic fertilizers tend to release slower. They make, conventional fertilizers that are slow release as well that you can mix in at planting time. That's always a good thing to do, especially for second crops of the year. And then, you're probably going to want to fertilize about every 1 to 2 weeks, depending on what you're using and how your soil is. And again, it's hard to say what's going on in your soil without a soil test, but if you get a soil test, they should be able to tell you, exactly how much to use and when to use it and things of that nature. Harvesting, it's going to be so nice to harvest your fall garden because you're not going to be going out there on a day like today when it's like 95 degrees out. I think it was supposed to be today. You're going to be able to go out when it's getting a little cooler and it's nice in the fall. So harvest fruits when they're fully developed. You want to obviously get most things out, unless there's something that can tolerate a little frost. You want to get things out before the first frost. In the morning is usually the best time to harvest, after the dew dries on nice dry days. Those are the best times to go out there and harvest just in general. Head greens like a cabbage or something like that, you want to harvest when the heads are fully developed. Harvest leafy greens really anytime. Leave some of the plants, harvest some of the older leaves, and leave the younger ones to continue developing so that you can harvest multiple times throughout the season. And then if you just had an amazing fall garden, you should consider preserving some of that, and so that you have it over the winter and the fall to use. There's canning, there's freezing, there's fermenting. There's so many options to preserve. Definitely don't ask me how you would go about that. But we have a really good family and consumer science agent, Laura, in our office, who I know does class series on all the different preservation methods that there are out there. So definitely check out our website, the CSU Extension Pueblo County website, and see what Laura's got coming up if that's something that you would be interested in learning more about. I do believe she's got some classes coming up in August. All right, let's talk season extension. So like I said, last year, I believe it froze like late September, but then it was nice again for a while. And that's not uncommon around here. So maybe you're just like, oh, I just need to get through this one random early cold night that we're having, and then my garden can keep going. So here's some techniques on what you can go out and do to kind of save some of your more tender plants from totally freezing and being, just done. So blankets and sheets, grandma's old method is how I think of that. Those work for sure. You can go out and throw, it's best if you can crop them up off the plant a little bit, because especially if they get wet or something like that, you don't really want them resting on the plants. But covering with blankets and sheets will definitely give you a little bit of protection if it's not like a really, really cold frost that we're getting. And you're going to want to go out and remove those during the day, just to recharge the heat from the sun, can recharge the heat in the soil. And just to keep them dry, you don't want those wet blankets and sheets sitting on your plants all day long. So if we have a couple of cold days, you'll want to put the blankets on at night, go out and take them off, and then go put them back on again the next night if needed. Floating row covers are something that are great. Those would be usually used with a frame that you've built, maybe like a hoop house or a low tunnel, something like that. And then the row covers are clear, so they transmit light. So you can actually leave them on for things like lettuce and herbs, things that don't necessarily need to be pollinated, things that are producing a fruit like peas or some of the squash. You need pollinators to have access to them. So floating row covers are going to have to be opened up during the day. But you can leave them on during the day for things that don't necessarily need pollinators. And you'll get about 2 to 4 degrees of protection from a floating row cover. You can also, they make special fabric for those kind of things. You can also just use a clear plastic on a frame. You don't want the plastic actually touching the plants, because if it does freeze, the plastic obviously gets cold, and then if the plastic is touching the plants, it's going to freeze whichever surfaces that it's touching. So you need some kind of frame or something to prop it up off of the plants. And of course, open that during the day, because that clear plastic can kind of become somewhat of a greenhouse and trap in a lot of heat and humidity. So you'll want to open that up during the day. If you have a space blanket, maybe in your old first aid kit or whatever, wherever you would get a space blanket, they have, the aluminum side and then the fabric side. So aluminum side down on top of sheets or plastic or floating row covers will give you a couple extra degrees of protection for sure. So that's a good thing to keep around if it's going to be real cold. And then you really want to try to get crazy and it's going to be really cold for a few days, Christmas lights, the C7 variety, kind of those old ones that get a little bit hot, not the LED ones that are more modern. But figuring out how to string those up inside the plastic at night. Of course, you want to be careful they're not touching the plastic so it doesn't melt or have a fire hazard or anything like that. But you can get 6 to 18 degrees of frost protection from the Christmas lights and plastic used together. That's a lot of degrees. Christmas lights, plastic, and a space blanket all together, you can get 18 to 30 degrees of frost protection, the research has shown. So, I mean, you can go pretty far into October, even maybe November, if you got a setup like that, and you can get started. I mean, imagine how early in the spring you could get started if you had some kind of setup like that. So consider those methods of season extension if that's something that you'd like to do. I don't have the picture on here of this, but there's also a product that you can buy called a wall of water. And what it is basically a ring of plastic tubes that you fill up with water. And for any chemists on the call, we know that when water freezes, it releases heat. So as that water freezes in those tubes, it'll kind of release heat and insulate a plant that's inside of the ring of tubes. So again, you don't want the plant to touch the plastic. So it's best for smaller plants, and honestly, probably better for next spring when you're starting new plants and maybe it's going to be chilly, but you already set out your plants or they're already growing out in your garden. You can set that wall of water. Or if you have some small, like maybe leaf lettuce or something in the fall, you can maybe use the wall of water on that. And that the walls of water can protect in temperatures down to the mid-teens. So that's great. So questions, type them into the chat. We have plenty of time to address any questions that you have. In the meantime, I will just direct you to my email address that's on the screen. If anything comes up that you would like to discuss about anything gardening, please let me know. Also, if you're on Facebook, follow us at Pueblo County Horticulture for all of our classes, events, and tons of helpful tips on all things gardening. And at All Pueblo Grows is actually our seed library Facebook page. And the seed library does a lot of great programming centered on vegetable gardening and things of that nature as well. So those are good things to check out. And I see a couple questions coming in the chat, so stay on and see if any of these are helpful to you. And I'm going to launch that poll in just a second here after I answer these questions. So yeah, one question is, do we harvest leafy greens and leafy herbs with the same strategy? Absolutely. Take the older leaves first. Usually you're harvesting from the outside in, and you can kind of leave the younger ones so you can harvest multiple times. And same strategy as far as doing it in the morning when it's cool and dry is ideal. Does fall gardening support pollinator populations? Yeah, absolutely, especially in flowering plants. You know, some of your peas, your squash, things like that do need to be pollinated that are in your fall garden. There's not, once you get to the end of the season, a lot of stuff is not quite as available for pollinators that are still out, and they are still out in the fall. So yes, this absolutely supports the pollinator population. So it's not only good for you, it's good for pollinators, which is great.
I would just add, especially butterflies in the fall.
Absolutely, yes, that's a good point, Patricia. We do see a lot of them out in the fall. And Laura asked the same question, fall gardening encourages fall pollinators. Absolutely, Laura. What kind of bugs are a problem with fall gardens? You know, you won't have many problems with a lot of bugs. You might get aphids, I think, might have some populations in the fall. I don't really think you're going to get a lot of the really tough ones that we deal with in the summer, like squash bugs, flea beetles. Those kind of things are probably mostly going to be done with their life cycles, so they shouldn't be a big problem. What else? You still might deal with fungal issues, like you still could get possibly like powdery mildew or diseases like that. So that could be something to look out for. The problems are going to be much less. And you know, if you do start seeing a problem, you more than welcome to send pictures over and we can figure out what it is and how to handle it. But I think maybe like aphids would be the most likely thing to see. What else? What other questions do we have? Type them into the chat, or actually feel free to unmute too if you'd like. Well, you think of any. I'm going to launch this poll really quick, and if you could just answer these two very easy questions for me, I would greatly appreciate your participation. You should be seeing that popping up on your screen. And of course, if you think of a question, I still got the chat open, and or you can unmute and ask me verbally. And of course, if anything comes up, you definitely are welcome to email me.
Cherie, do you plant a garden or a fall garden, and what do you plant and what do you recommend? What grows best?
I think that I would normally go for like first. I think they're easy. They grow good once it starts to cool down. So that's what I would normally go for. I know a lot of people are really into those root crops that I haven't really personally dabbled in them too much. But yeah, I'd say I'm more of like a late season lettuce person.
Cherie, I don't know if you saw this question. How are coffee grounds for compost?
Great. Yeah, adding coffee grounds either directly into the soil or into a compost pile, that's a fantastic thing to do. Absolutely. And thank you so much to those of you who answered the poll questions. It looks like everybody who's still on did. I appreciate that. And I will definitely be on for, the next little while if anybody wants to chat about their garden. If not, then I just hope you have a fantastic day and I wish you the best.
That was a fun talk today. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks for tuning in. It's good to talk to you again. Thanks a lot for your help, Patricia. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. We had a whopping 12 of our 99 come. That's great.
Well, I'll take it. I think I had a few people emailing asking if they could watch the recording. So
yeah.